Okay, let me begin. Um, Hello and welcome to the third seminar in the History of Emotions seminar series. Our guest today is Professor Barbara Rosenwein from Loyola University Chicago. Professor Rosenwein is among the founders of the field, and we are truly honored to have her with us. Our previous two seminars in the series, the first one by Professor William Reddy and the second one by Professor Thomas Dixon, went quite well and attracted a lot of attention. A good number of academics and students have so far registered and take interest in is growing. I must confess that the interest shown went beyond our initial expectations, and we are happy to provide a platform for this ongoing and lively academic conservation. Content-wise, with the seminar, we are shifting our focus from historiography to methodology. As far as we can see, many academics and graduate students are now considering more seriously working on history of emotions and worrying about, wonder what kind of methodological problems they may encounter. Professor Rosenwein will introduce and discuss functions and practicalities of some basic methodological approaches. These include terms emotionology, Reddy's emotives and emotional regimes, and Professor Rosenwein's emotional communities. Professor Rosenwein will also share her expertise and experience with us in approaching the sources through these methods. We wonder how sources, which have had emotions but kept silent for long, can tell us about the emotions, history of emotions. We are now listening. I'm going to introduce her biography. Rosenwein held a PhD from University of Chicago in 1974, and she taught at Loyola University Chicago from 1974 to 2015. She has various academic positions, like being visiting professor at Oxford University. Her research interests range from religion in medieval society to anger. She is particularly interested in European medieval age. She produced some remarkable works on the medieval age, such as debating the Middle Ages, issues and readings, and a short history of the Middle Ages. She has some professional organization memberships as well, such as fellowship in Medieval Academy of America. When it comes to history of emotions, she is one of the prominent names in the field. She changed direction of the field irreversibly with her concept, emotional communities. She started to concentrate on emotions historically with the article Worrying About Emotions in History, and in 2002. Then she contributed to the field with many interesting and significant works, including What is the History of Emotions, Love, A History in Five Fantasies, and Anger, The Conflicted History of Emotions. Currently, she is a Professor Emeritus of Loyola University Chicago. Thank you, Professor Barbara Rosenwein. It's an honor to have you here on the seminar series. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. I hardly recognized myself with your wonderful introduction. And I want to say it's an honor to be here and to be addressing a truly international audience about a topic about which I am so passionate. I want to thank the organizers, Mehmet and Farouk. I dare not try to pronounce their last names, but Mehmet is right here before you. And I want to thank them for giving me this opportunity to speak to you. So now I'm going to share my screen, and it's going to be mainly a PowerPoint. If there's a issue in this PowerPoint where you wish that I would give a little bit more explanation or talk a little bit more, elaborate a little bit, just put up your hand. And I will try to take note of that. Although I don't know if I can when I share my screen. Well, at any rate, I keep it for the end then, for the question and answer, because I've made the assumption here that you already know the theory of emotionology, the theory of ready and emotional regimes, and so on. And what I intend to talk about is, how do you use them? When do you use them? Why do you use them? And are they the only theories and approaches that you can use? So with that, I will share my screen, if I can find it. So how to practice the history of emotions? Well, you probably already, in your writing of history, talk about emotions without even thinking about it. Historians have always done that, whether to spice up their prose or to deliver a moral judgment about a person or a group. Here, for example, is what Frank Babinger said in his classic book, Mehmet the Conqueror, when he was talking about the first entry of Mehmet into Constantinople. He went first to Hagia Sophia. On entering, his first glance fell on a Turk who, in a destructive frenzy, was hacking away at the marble floor with an axe. The Sultan asked him why he was destroying the floor. For the faith, the Turk replied. Enraged at such barbarism, Mehmed struck at him with his sword. Now here we see certain emotions brought up. The Turk who was in a frenzy, Mehmet who was enraged. But Babinger is really making a point not about how Mehmet really felt, but about his virtue, his righteous anger. And in a way, this passage tells us more about Babinger and his own values than it does about Mehmet, let alone about the emotional practices and expectations of the Ottomans. But let's say that you are interested in those practices and expectations. How might you go about studying them? Or how might you take up the emotions of a small group within that larger culture? Because the Ottomans was not just one monopoly. There were smaller groups within their sultanate. Or what if you want to look at a time period before or after, or other cultures or mixes of cultures? Well, the first question you must think about is why you want to bother. Oh, I can't get this to go. Why do you want to bother studying emotions? Because others are going to ask you, they're going to object. They're going to want to know why you bother with them. They'll say emotions can't have a history because they are universal at all times and places. And even if they are historical, they're tangential to real history, the history of acts, battles, explorations, mass movements. And here you can see, and on Amazon.com, there's a shirt that's on sale. It's got Mehmet II with a bogus picture of him entering Constantinople. And that's history, right? At least a lot of people think so. They might even admit that there's other kinds of history, like the history of thought or the history of religion. But emotions? Now, there are many answers to these objections, and I'm going to mention just two of them. First, the study by Paul Ekman and Walter Friesen that supposedly proved that emotions are universal and constant across cultures. That study was highly flawed. It argued that certain few emotional facial expressions, such as the one for happiness, a big smile, for example, were universal, recognized universally, and those were the emotions. Happiness was the emotion, and all other emotions, or what people call emotions, are combinations or simply misguided ideas. Now, if you want to see a full critique of this hypothesis of Ekman and Friesen, read Ruth Leigh's Ascent of Affect. The second answer you can give to historians who say, come on, there's no such thing as history of emotions, is that by now there is a history of emotions. A small mountain of historical research has accumulated, showing that emotions do change over time and that emotions cause and motivate historical development. So that just seeing Mehmet walking into Constantinople needs further problematization. Why did he do that? What motivated him? Well, now what you want to do, I assume, because you're at this seminar, is find out my ideas about how you can add to that small mountain of historical research. And by now there are many different approaches, most of which have already been taken up in earlier seminars by Professors William Reddy and Thomas Dixon. What I want to do here is ask how, when, and why do you apply those approaches? How do you practice the history of emotions? Well, the first step is very simple. Okay. You gather the sources, this is the top of your screen, you gather the sources that pertain to your topic. So the first thing you need to know is what you're interested in. You can't just say, I want to do the history of emotions. You say, I want to understand Mehmet and why he went to Constantinople. And so what sources are available to tell us about that? What approach then, once you've got your sources, will work well for you, for the particular questions that you're asking of the sources? So just like any historian, no matter whether you're a political historian or a social historian, the first thing you need to do is say, let me gather all my sources. And then you ask what approach will work well for the questions I want to ask about these sources or with these sources. Now, I want to talk a little bit about how each approach handles the sources. And the first approach I want to talk about is emotionology. I'm going to imagine, I never talked to him about it, so I don't know for sure, that Peter Stearns first started gathering advice literature because he wanted to see how child rearing and marital advice changed over time. And what he discovered was that in order to understand those changes, he had to recognize that advice manuals talk a great deal about managing emotions, about emotional standards. In fact, what he discovered was that emotional standards drove the advice and not vice versa. So it was from that recognition, I hypothesize, that he began to elaborate the theory and the technique of emotionology, which says that while emotions may remain stable, standards about those emotions, how they should be expressed, where they should be expressed, those things change, and the historian can look at them. And the way the historian looks at them is through advice manuals. But not every era has advice manuals. And even so, emotionology may be a very useful approach for you if you're asking certain kinds of questions. For example, imagine that you're interested in changing notions of the hero. You'll want to know, of course, the ordinary things that historians need to know. Is the hero human? Is the hero male or female, young or old, and how these things change over time? If you're lucky, those topics have already been studied by others, and that will allow you to concentrate on different issues, emotional issues. You'll want to ask whether there are emotional changes. Does the hero weep or never weep? Does she express pride, as with Athena the Brain, or humility, as in certain kinds of Christian heroes? Or does the hero love the gods or humans or animals? Or is the hero aloof from love of anything? Does the hero express fear, sadness, and in what circumstances do these change over time? And all of this is perfectly available via the techniques of emotionology, about thinking about emotional standards. Or imagine that you're interested in childhood from the 16th to the 20th century. Well, of course, you'll want to know the ordinary things that historians always want to know about: changes in ratios of young to old, birth rates, the importance of breastfeeding, and so on. Others may have already done that work, leaving you free to look at a variety of those sources, plus maybe some new sources, such as clay dolls, rattles, bottles. You'll want to ask, what feelings do various authors of the 16th to the 20th century have as they talk about their childhoods? Do they remember childhood with regret, with joy, with sentimentality? And what evidence do you have for the feelings of children? What emotions at different times were considered childish? And did those change with passing of time? Were childish, so-called childish emotions encouraged, suppressed, laughed at? Were there nursery rhymes and fairy tales or other books for children? And if so, what emotions did those sources express? And how did those change over time? So you can see that emotionology can be very useful as a set of questions to ask your sources. But let's move on from emotionology. For following William Reddy, many historians of emotions have become interested in the political uses of emotions and the emotional uses of politics. So I'm going to make an imaginary scenario about William Reddy, that when he first started working on his topic about the French Revolution, he asked himself, what are the elements of social control exercised by political regimes? And it was only in the course of studying that he realized that political regimes control the most intimate aspects of ourselves, our inner feelings. The French Revolution happened not because, or at least not only because, of high taxes or the rise of the bourgeois classes or the rationality of the Enlightenment. It happened because people sought relief from the highly unemotional culture of the court of the monarchy. This is the court of Louis XIV, and or representation of it. And Reddy hypothesized that people who found this highly repressive found relief in what he called emotional refuges, which, in contrast to the restrained emotions of the court, were very effusive, over the top. And so here we see a salon of the sort that Reddy was talking about. This happens to be Voltaire, one of Voltaire's salons, where people talk and interact and allow their emotions full play. And then, when they rebelled against the monarchy, these people adopted the emotional norms of the refuges and thus launched a newly effusive emotional regime. This is supposed to show us the French Revolution, with people being carried off in the cart to the guillotine. And then that emotional regime became repressive in its own way, thus making necessary the opening up of different kinds of refuges. Now, my point here today is less what Reddy's book argued than that his method, now, in other words, analyzing the way in which regimes, all political regimes, manage people's emotions, may be applied to historical situations apart from the French Revolution. Consider the emotional norms, for example, of the Abbasids under Harun al-Rashid, or of the Carolingians around the same time, or of the Ottomans under Mehmed II, or of Nazism under Hitler, or the Irish Catholic Church in the 1950s, because you don't need really a governmental body to be an emotional regime. If a church is imposing its norms upon people, then it too is an emotional regime. And then again, you have to ask, to what degree were these regimes successful in imposing their norms? And here I'm using the statue of Laocoon and his sons trying to get away from the serpents as a kind of metaphor for the way the serpents being the emotional regime, the way in which they're trying to control these people who are fighting against them, but in the case of Laocoon and his sons, unsuccessfully. But sometimes emotional regimes are not very successful and will be replaced by other emotional regimes. Then again, the Reddy also postulates emotional refuges. Of course, poor Laocoon and his sons couldn't find an emotional refuge, but people in larger political regimes might be able to carve out for themselves places in which they don't have to follow the prescribed norms. And here you'll have to gather, if you want to know what those refuges are, I would think you have to gather new sources, because for the emotional norms of the regime, mainly you're going to use the propaganda of the machine, of the regime. In the United States, we have political machines of the regime. But if you want to look at the emotional refuges, you're going to have to look at, for example, the emotional flavor, as it were, of the salons or the theaters or whatever existed at the time that you're looking at. And you really need to ask yourself whether emotional refuges invariably exist. And then you must ask yourself whether the emotional refuges themselves were historically important. Reddy found the effusive emotional refuges of the 18th century to be very important historically, but you may find marginal groups that are different from the norms, but nevertheless are really historically very unimportant. And you need to ask yourself that kind of question. How important are these, and in what ways? Now, what Reddy calls emotional refuges, I call emotional communities. While Reddy is interested in the aspects of these groups that offer alternatives to the emotional regime, I'm interested in the whole spectrum of emotions that were recognized, expressed, valued, devalued, and deployed politically and otherwise by these groups. So I see emotional regimes as another emotional community, a hegemonic one, to be sure. But marginal emotional communities may and often do come to the fore, as, for example, Reddy's salon emotional refuges, which I would call an emotional community. Or you could think also of the initially marginal Christian groups that dotted the Roman Empire, but that eventually came to the fore within the late Roman Empire. To study an emotional community means first to ask, what were the emotions? Often we find them in Western cultures as words, experiences, virtues connected with the heart. I would say that the worst thing to do is to look at your sources and say, I see happiness there, or a word that is vaguely like happiness. So that's an emotion. Oh, because Ekman says that's an emotion. Rather, look at the words connected by your sources with the heart, or in Western culture, it's mainly with the heart, but it can also be with the mind, it can be with the liver, it can be from out of inside the human being, because the emotions for one emotional community can be quite different from the emotions of another. And some cultures may locate those emotions in one place and others elsewhere. And some communities don't recognize emotions at all, which should also be of interest to the historian. Well, what should your technique be? It's nothing surprising. And that's why I've got that piece of paper with a magnifying glass there. Gather your sources, read them, become sensitive to their nuances and to the contexts in which they're written. Try not to impose preconceived ideas of what emotions might be on them. For example, the Paston family in the 15th century England seemed to most historians, and to me too at first, not to express any emotions at all. But eventually I realized that they used their own peculiar emotional vocabulary. For example, they said they were heavy at heart on occasions when others, even people living at the same time, but part of different emotional communities, others would use the word sad. In my book, Generations of Feeling, I also asked what theories of emotions from the period help explain the particular understanding and a deployment of emotions in the emotional community I'm looking at. For example, I found it helpful to understand the emotional community of the Pastons by exploring the theory of emotions of the scholastic Jean Gerson, who worked in the 15th century. And it would be very interesting and intellectually challenging, if any of you are modern historians, to try to illuminate the many emotional communities that exist today with the equally varied theories of emotions that contemporary theorists offer. Because we've got Ekman and Friesen, but we've got other kinds of contemporary theorists, and maybe different emotional communities adhere to one or the other. Actually, one thing is certain, the various facial expressions identified by Ekman and Friesen as invariable and universal are today taught in the United States to school children, so that the Ekman theory is, in a way, becoming an emotional regime, crowding out all the multiple emotions that people can and have in the past expressed. Well, once you have the vocabulary and perhaps the theory, you'll want to ask, which emotions did this group value most? Which did they avoid? How did they express them? Did they gesture a lot? Did they smile, blush? And then go on to ask, what purposes did these emotions serve? Did they bind communities together? Did they isolate communities from one another? Did they impose moral imperatives like the early Christian communities? Did the emotions were they there to achieve some higher goal or goals? And how natural were they understood to be? Consider that court of Louis XIV. How artificial it seems to us, but perhaps people liked being there. Perhaps they felt comfortable. Perhaps for them, it seemed as natural as rain and snow. It's also important to realize that emotions often come in clusters, that even though we talk about anger as something separate and sadness as something else separate, in fact, in real life, people often feel a mixture. They feel angry, sad. They feel hopeful, apprehensive. And the other obvious truth about emotions is that they don't stay static forever. They move very quickly from one to another, so that in an emotional sequence, you may be feeling very happy. Oh, I am not living in Ukraine. No one is bombing me. Then you feel guilty about being happy, but how can I be happy when all these people are being killed? And then you feel sad. So sequences are also true about emotions. And that's part of the questions that you would ask about emotional communities. And there are yet other questions that you might ask, such as how did the emotional community that you're looking at compare to other emotional communities around the same time? To what degree was it possible or even necessary for individuals in one community to adapt to another? For example, you can think about, I have here a picture of immigrant children. How easy was it for them to adapt their emotional expectations brought over from the country that they originally lived in to the norms of the new one? And then, did the emotional community you're looking at change or adapt over time, or did it remain static? For example, I'm thinking about Mennonite communities in the United States, which, at least from the outside, I haven't done a real study of them, seem to be fairly static. They're also very marginal within the United States. So the idea of emotional communities then leads to all kinds of questions, but admittedly it rests largely on careful scrutiny of emotional vocabulary. And it's been criticized for this. After all, people gesture, jump up and down, cross their fingers, and express feelings without saying one word. Emojis depend upon that fact. Emojis are not words. Monique Shear argues that emotions are not only expressed by practices, such as jumping up and down, but they're elicited by them. She gives the example of Methodists whose religious practices were emotional and designed to elicit emotions. And here we have an example, it's not quite Methodist, but it's a revivalist camp during the Great American Awakening of the early 19th century. And you see dramatic gestures, people swooning, people kneeling in penance as the preacher preaches fire and brimstone. I don't see emotional practices as an alternative to the others, but rather as a necessary adjunct in many instances. Why necessary? Because it teases out emotional facts that are not revealed by the other techniques. When I was studying the emotional community of an early American Puritan congregation, I wanted to know if there were gender differences. In oral testimonials of their conversion to God, offered in front of the entire congregation they wanted to join, both men and women described their life course and heartfelt transformations. While the accounts differed in many ways when it came to emotions, well, the accounts differed, but when it came to emotions, both men and women used the same vocabulary. And the emotional sequences they talked about were equivalent, though the men expressed greater confidence that they were saved than did the women. But I discovered a really big difference when I thought about practices, because the men were clearly more active, traveled further to seek out preachers, and engaged in more rituals of worship. So there were differences, but the best way to find them is to think about practices. Emotionology, emotional regimes, emotional communities, and emotional practices are the principal theories on which the techniques of emotions research have been based. But I'd like to mention two others if I have time. Do I have time?
Please go ahead, Professor Rosenwein.
Okay. I'd like to mention two others that I've used when the nature of the topic seemed to require it. For my major point of this whole lecture is that the subject that you want to investigate and the sources that you have at your disposal will be the chief determinants of your approach. So when I wanted to understand the history of anger, I considered how aligned it was in every instance with a moral stance, morality being the key factor in the different ways in which anger was expressed and experienced. In some emotional communities, it was rejected. In others, it was rejected, yes, as a vice, but it was a moral issue, and sometimes it was a virtue. And then those communities who considered anger natural accepted it, did not reject it, and in fact, nowadays in the United States, it's often celebrated. Hieronymus Bosch put a representation of anger on his painting of the 7 deadly sins. Here's anger, okay? 2 men fighting. There they are. And this guy's wife is probably trying to restrain him. That's the vice of anger. But in the same Christian culture in which Bosch was working, there was also the idea of righteous anger, good anger, virtuous anger, as in the righteous anger of God, as he drives Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. So here we have one essentially Christian emotional community that nevertheless supported 2 contrasting emotionologies, both of them normative within the emotional regime of the church and later within Protestant groups. And my final example, a very different approach, was necessary when I turned to love, which means so many things at the same time. It was only as I was wrestling with this topic that I realized the unrecognized significance of the Ekman-Friesen experiment. They had gone to Papua New Guinea with photographs showing faces posed with the expressions that they considered universal. The 4 people to whom they showed these photos were initially utterly confused. Here we have the universal facial expression of happiness, but the four people didn't know what to make of it until they were told a story. The story was, her friends have come and she is happy. Then they could fit the face or facial expression into a context, into a narrative that made sense for them. Of course, that wasn't the conclusion of Ekman and Friese, but what I realized was that narratives are ways, maybe the only ways, in which we understand and make sense of our many conflicting emotions. We may give simple names to these emotions like anger, sadness, love, but in fact, they make no sense at all unless they're part of a story. Some of these stories or memes or narratives or fantasies, and that's really what emojis are trading on, that there is already a story behind that emoji. Some of these stories are of very long duration. Consider the fantasy that love takes us beyond ourselves and the ordinary world. It's rapturously captured in Chagall's birthday painting of 1915. But it has a very long history, dating back at least to Plato's Symposia, where Socrates describes how the soul in love goes higher and higher, starting with human lovers, moving beyond them to ideas and forms, and finally to beauty itself and dwelling with the gods. The ascent of love was taken up by Neoplatonists and Christians, and the idea persists today, as in Jackie Wilson's song, "Love keeps lifting me higher and higher." I can't play the YouTube for you because it's under copyright, but you can all find Jackie Wilson singing this. And as he is speaking of higher and higher, his voice becomes a higher and higher falsetto. Of course, the contexts are entirely different. Plato was writing for philosophers in 4th century BCE Athens. Christians elaborated on a mystical ascent to God. Wilson is speaking of a feeling of exaltation with his girlfriend, but a core narrative of the feeling remains. And now contrast that with the narrative that underpins Carrie Jenkins's current love for her husband and at the same time for her boyfriend. She calls it polyamory. And it too has a long history, dating back to ancient Greece and extending to the Middle Ages and beyond. So, to sum up, when you wish to do the history of emotions, you should, of course, have an understanding of the major approaches that have already had some success and know how to apply them. But you should also recognize that emotions are exceptionally complex and bewildering. They have political, moral, and social uses, among others. As you think about the ways in which you practice and want to practice the history of emotions, be open to many possibilities, even as and as long as you remain true to your sources and your purposes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rosenwein, for this very ground-setting talk. I think for starters or for anyone who is interested in the history of emotions, this will be a good start to really listen. to your talk. You can open the Q&A session. If you have questions, you can raise your digital hand. We're going to follow the previous methods. We will enable you to ask questions directly yourself. So the first person who raised her hand is Sonia Garcia de Alba, if I'm correctly pronouncing your name. Let's unmute her and hear her question. Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Rosenwein, for this fantastic lecture. I was actually thinking about this last thing you mentioned about the narratives of feeling and how we construct emotions using stories around this. And I was thinking, I'm currently working on a project that focuses on using literature as a source for the study of emotions. And I wondered if perhaps you could elaborate a little bit more on how you see a source that has been deemed, so subjective in comparison to other more historical sources, so to speak, fitting into this narrative of the history of emotions.
Yes, well, in my book on love, I bring in a lot of literature as well as other kinds of sources. And I think that it's just wonderful to be able to put this together, to take literature and put it together with other literature from the same time. And I mean, the more texture you have for studying the emotions, the truer you will be to the complexity of the period. But it all depends, of course, on your question. If you're asking just about one author and that author's emotional world, then of course you're not going to necessarily put that together with another author. But you might want to say, well, where does this come from? Is this just fully born out of the brain of your author, or does your author belong to a larger culture? And then you're really starting to do what I would call history in the cultural sense. Thank you. You know, there are lots of questions coming in on the chat, so you want to.
So we have two questions now, one by Mehmet Kara, and then we'll have Nicole Elizabeth Barnes' question. Mehmet, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much for this great presentation, dear Professor Rosenwein. I have a question regarding this interdisciplinary part of the methodology, because what I am interested in is especially applying this method to political science and international relations. You postulated something important in this fields with emotional communities. And we see a few scholars are working on this concept in their IR theory. Do you think it is correct to apply this to these emotional communities to international relations, or do you think it's really a good approach, or it's a kind of inapplicable because of this, because it's confined to history, the field of history? What do you think about that?
Oh, it's not confined to the field of history at all. I think that emotional communities is an expandable notion. If you're dealing with it in international relations, you're dealing with I don't know how you want to think about it. Do you want to think about the emotional communities of the diplomats? That's very restrictive. Or do you want to think about the emotional communities of the countries that these diplomats are representing, which would be huge? And then you would need to recognize that that may be hegemonic. You may be talking about a hegemonic emotional community, but that there wouldn't very likely be smaller emotional communities within. even diplomats may differ and feel differently about what is being put on the table or what their role is. So it's all, the question is really, what is your question? What do you want to know? What do you want to study? What do you want to understand? And with that in mind, you'll figure out how to use the concept of emotional communities. But emotional communities is, you cannot put an emotional community under the microscope, just as you cannot put an emotion under the microscope. You have a heuristic idea, a device that helps you organize your ideas, your thoughts, your questions, your sources. And it can be very, very expansive, or it can be quite small. An emotional community could be just one family, or it could be really the emotional community of the United States, which I would say is really two emotional communities at the present moment.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Nicole Elizabeth Barnes. Can we unmute?
Yeah, it took me a while to unmute myself. Thank you so much for this talk. It was fantastic. I took a lot of notes, and also just thank you for your theories. You may not know, in a 2018 book, I used your theory of emotional communities to uncover a very important aspect of modern Chinese history, that essentially the nationalists produced an emotional community that rendered the poor an other, and the communists created an emotional community that warmly welcomed them into the fold. And that's really a major part of how they won the revolution and took control of the country in 1949. So thank you for that. Yes. And now I'm embarking on a history of night soil and toileting practices in modern China, which confronts the history of disgust. So my question is, if you could walk us through in a detailed fashion how you shed and discard your own assumptions about an emotion. For example, when you're writing a history of love, of anger, these are emotions that also live in our bodies. We have such profound lived experiences of them, assumptions about what they are. When you confront your sources, how do you leave behind that whole mental and physical contraption to actually see what the sources give you?
Insofar as I've been successful, and I would have to give that caveat, it does have to do with this almost strict scientific attempt to find the words that are connected in my sources with the heart. So what is connected with the heart? Now, in Chinese sources, I don't know how, if you've got a discussion of disgust in any kind of context, and what is the context for that, for treatment of that. But of course, you've already done a lot of work on Chinese vocabulary and Chinese emotions. So you may already have a pretty good idea of which words, which expressions, they don't have to be single words, but expressions like heavy at heart, really have emotional valence within your sources. And you do the best you can. Historians, I mean, we don't condemn Babinger for coming at Mehmet with his own preoccupations. He's still considered such an important historian that his book is constantly translated and reprinted and so on. I think you're really going beyond what ordinary historians can do with emotions just by asking, how do I get rid of my own presuppositions? You're welcome. Very interesting topic, fantastic topic. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Yan Liu.
Hi, Professor Rosenwein. Thank you for your wonderful talk. I'm like Professor Barnes. I'm also a Chinese historian. I specialize in medieval China, Chinese medicine, and also there's a dimension of my research that connects to the history of emotions in medieval China. And my question is that, so I wonder, in your study of various kinds of emotions, whether there are differences between, I mean, generally speaking, there are emotions we may say more, universal, like love, like anger, but other kind of emotions, I'm thinking of, because I'm quite interested in the history of jealousy in China, in medieval China particularly, there's a gender connection there as well. An emotion like jealousy, do you think that's more sort of subject to the kind of social construction? Because, all the sources I read in medieval China about jealous women, especially jealous wives, they are prescriptive sources, actually, right? So with very strong moral imperative, they are usually, if not always, written by men, right? So I'm thinking about how to use your idea of emotional communities to try to study jealous wives in medieval China to, I mean, sort of following, Professor Barnes' question, right? How to get the emotions of this woman, given the sources I have, so all prescriptive sources, right? So thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, I don't think that anger and love are less emotionally, socially constructed than other emotions like jealousy. I don't think that anger and love are universal. They're getting universalized because of mass media and because of the you might say the hegemony of Western ideas, especially Western scientific ideas. But as far as jealousy is concerned, well, of course, you at this point, your sources are perfect not to look at emotional communities, but to look at emotionologies. Yeah. But maybe like Professor Barnes, no, there was another question where the questioner, I'm so sorry, I forgot your name, was asking about literature. Can you find any literature that's, even if it's written by men, but even better if it's written by some women, that might feed into your understanding of jealousy? And can you find medical treatises? Can you find treatments of marital problems or problems in love? I don't know what the sources are, but if you're just looking at these prescriptive sources, you can do a wonderful study of the emotionology and the changing emotionology about jealousy. But I don't think you can really talk about, well, you can talk about the emotional communities of men writing prescriptive literature. That you can talk about. But I don't think you can really get at how do the women feel unless you can somehow, and usually in literature, you can see how women, at least I did in my book on love, where I found patriarchy was dominant throughout Western history. There's no question about it. And yet women found ways to exert their own visions, their own feelings, sort of under the table, but nevertheless very, very truly. So, and I found that mainly in literature, but also in some letters. I don't know what you have in way of sources, but open wide the sources and see what the possibilities are.
Thank you. Now there are 2 questions asked in chat room. Let me read them. The first one is, are autobiographies considered a good source for history of emotions? And the second one, I'm working on, well, I can't say the full name. Dab wrote in the chat room, everyone can read it. I'm working on a project that examines how the families of individuals who died on polar expeditions far from home coped and worked through their grief. Have you any thoughts on how to deal with clashes within emotional communities as individuals / families who had previously formed emotional community together sought to cope with such tricky emotions as grief in different or conflicting ways? So these 2 questions.
Really interesting question. Okay, to answer the first question, which is quite easy, really. Of course, autobiographies can be useful. Of course, leave no source unturned. Definitely, that certainly is very, very important. Of course. As for Deb's question, when an emotional community has to deal with emotions that it has not dealt with much before, has not valued much before, has not thought about much before, you're really asking a new question in the history of emotions that I think is a very, very interesting and important one. But it is not the question that has previously, that I know of, previously been brought up. So I guess what I would do if I were interested in that question would be to gather all the sources I could on these families prior to the deaths of their loved ones, and then assume a real break when they hear about the death and see what remains constant in those sources afterwards, but what is new in the sources afterwards, so that you can really understand transformations as well as static stasis. I'm thinking of a study that I read, it's not out yet, I don't think, of Jewish ideas about love in before and during Nazi Germany, and then afterwards. And what it showed to me was that the assumptions about love were perfectly German and adhered to the emotional norms of those living under the Nazi regime, whether German or Jewish. But that, and even immediately after the survivors came out of the concentration camps. But then there was a break, and the young Jews had very different expectations and norms about the nature of love between men and women. And this is by C. Christian Bailey, but it isn't out yet, but it's Stanford University Press.
All right, thank you. There's another question, but before that, Katerina Stefan raised her hand. Let's hear her question.
Thank you, Professor Rosenwein. That was such an interesting talk. I am currently working on my PhD and I'm working on Puritan emotions in New England, anger and sorrow. And I am also looking at how the spatial organization of New England intentionally or unintentionally enforced dominant emotional regimes or emotional refuges and so on and so forth. And I was wondering, because I'm doing this, whether you would distinguish between emotions and physical sensations, for example, such as pain. Because I was wondering, for example, if I look at the meeting house in the winter, when people might have traveled on horseback and now they come there and listen to a sermon that takes 2 hours, and the ones that are lower in social rank will sit at the back, and it's much colder than the ones that sit at the front where there's a fire. How can I work with this without being anachronistic? Because me, obviously, living in a house quite warm, I would experience this very, very differently. And I cannot actually say if people would have felt cold and if that would actually affect the way they would have experienced the atmosphere. So is it, do you think, possible to work with this without having actual sources, written sources that will say, I feel cold, and this is how this changed my experience? Can I do this or can't I do it?
I don't know. It's a really good question. I think that the newest work in the history of emotions is trying to include pain. It's trying to include, it's elaborating a new rubric called the history of experience, which would be sensations and pain and so on. I think that although you may not be able to talk about the sensation of cold, you can surely ask yourself why the poor people are sitting at the back and how that might be experienced. And in there, if your congregations have those confessionals or testimonials that Puritans so often had, whether you can figure out whether the people who are sitting at the back are also giving testimonials, and whether those testimonials have differences from those being given by the elites who just come in from their horse and carriage or something like that. I think that you can get at the different experiences of people sitting in the back and people sitting in the front. And that's really a very interesting way of thinking about it. But you can just say it may be that they are colder because the wind whips into the doors of the church, and especially if you've gone to the church and have sat in it, and if it's still in pretty much the condition that it was in colonial America, you can test it out. I don't think that, I think that you can say the best guess is that they were cold, but there's no, that's all you can say. Yeah, sure.
Okay, now there is another question written in the chat room asking, I was wondering if you distinguish between passions and emotions in early modern time.
Well, yes, because passions, well, it's not so much that there's a distinction between passions in the early modern time and emotions today as how these equally affective categories are experienced and thought about at the different times that I would think you would want to be interested in. It's not, it's true that we could say passions come from the Latin passio, which from which we get our notion of passion, passive, and so. But really it's not the etymology of the word or even what people call these affective experiences. It's which affective experiences are important, how they're experienced, when, and how they change over time. So I find, at least within Western culture, there is, you might say, a continuity of memes between passions and emotions, so that within Western culture, at least, there is really a tradition that leads from passions to emotions in our vocabulary. In fact, passions, although that is a term that's used a lot, is used a lot also side by side with terms like motus. And motus and emotus, motion and emotion, are very much aligned and allied. So I wouldn't worry about, is there a big distinction, but rather really ask myself, well, what phenomenon are these people talking about?
All right, the last question by Nilab Saidi, and then we'll be closing the seminar.
Professor, although many people said, but let me say it once again, thank you for your wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it. I have two questions. Firstly, I have this dilemma kind of where to put history of emotions. Like, is it something more close to history as a science or to psychology? Because whenever we talk about emotion and all, psychology comes first, kind of thing. I don't know. That's what I think. This first question. The second question, because you started with sources of Ottoman Empire, like for Mehmed II, but we always have in history, especially as a field, we have this problem of sources. Like sources are kind of the fruit of our science, I would say, of our field. They're very important, but still we have this problem of to trust a source or not to trust a source. Because sometimes the writer or the historian in chronicles and all things, they're kind of generalizing stuff. Like I'll give one example of 16th century Ottoman Empire. We have a historian, his name is Mustafa Ali, but because he is unhappy, he says that all empires are unhappy because he is not getting what he wants. So he's saying that there's a great decline going on. No one is getting what they want. Everyone is sad. Okay, this is his idea. So by reading him, can we think, or can I say that all Ottoman Empire in 16th century was sad?
Okay. To talk about your first question first, you think of emotions as connected with psychology today because the psychologists have an emotional regime over all of us, and that's what we think. If you were talking in the 17th century, you would say, oh, when I think about emotions, I think about theology. Theologians are the ones who talked about emotions, or philosophers, but theologians and philosophers many times were the same. So can you, how do you categorize the history of emotions? It's history. Yes? But it brings in psychology just as history brings in military strategy. Your second question is really wonderful. No, you can't believe your writer that the whole country is sad, right? But you can believe your writer that he thinks so, or that he wants his readers to think so. And you can ask, why? Why does he want me, or his contemporary reader, because he does, to think this? What will he get out of it? What is his strategy here? And if you put him together with other people, I don't know, you can begin to talk about a very, well, let me just hypothesize without any evidence at all, that he is trying to manipulate his reader for a particular purpose. You're laughing. Why are you laughing?
Can we unmute Nida, please? Can we unmute her? Nilab, can you try unmuting yourself?
Professor, sorry, I'm laughing because Mustafa Ali has this. Whenever I read, I feel that he's trying to manipulate us and tell us that everything is so bad, although it's not, but it's his personal thing. He's not getting the job, for example. He wants to be the chief scribe, for example, but he's not getting that. So he's telling that, no, everything is so bad, and he's trying to manipulate his readers, and not only readers, even like, in sense, because he was presenting these writings to sultans or to grand viziers to show them also. That was his idea.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it brings up the thought that perhaps other courtiers or people who are attempting to curry favor will use emotions in similar manipulative ways. And that too is very interesting from the point of view of history of emotions. Yeah, it's wonderful. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Rosenwein, for accepting our invitation, for sparing your time, for giving this wonderful talk, and also you had great questions.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Thank all of you for your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor. Our next seminar will be in the form of panel discussion 2 weeks later, and we will this time dig into the history of emotions in the field of Ottoman history. Maybe the last question is directly related, but we'll start the next time. And again, you're all invited. And thank you very much again. Many thanks, and we're closing.